Hello, I'm Penny Roberts. I'm Professor of Early Modern European History at the University of Warwick. And I'm also at the moment Fellow here at the Institut d'études avancées in Paris. I'm a historian of 16th century France. And my project here is to look at the relationship between the Huguenots and the Catholics in Paris, but also more widely in France as a whole. The 16th century saw the French religious wars, which divided the Protestants, the French Protestants known as Huguenots, and the Catholics within France. The Huguenots were always a minority, but they were quite a substantial minority and able to pose a particular challenge to the crown and to the government of France at the time. But there's lots of ebbs and flows within the wars, so there are periods when there are military conflicts, but there are also periods of peace, periods of persecution, periods when the Huguenots are having to look at how to sustain themselves within a hostile polity as a political context. The particular project that I'm looking at is to examine how the Huguenots are able to sustain themselves in this environment when they're trying to communicate across the country, also with members of their community in exile abroad. And so there's a sort of wider context to thinking about the Huguenots during this period. The beginning of my project was a single document, an interrogation document of a man, a merchant, who's arrested in Dieppe because he's smuggling correspondence in a basket of cheese between France and England. And from this document, which I thought was very interesting, I wanted to sort of investigate what happened to this man. I was unable to do that. There's no record of him in the judicial records for the period, for instance. So what could I do with this sort of document? What historians do when they have a single sort of small piece of the puzzle is to think about microhistory. So taking one document, as in this case, or one incident which happened on one day in May 1570 in Dieppe, and to extrapolate from that to think about what it says to us about the wider context of the 16th century. So what I've done from this is to look at other people who were arrested for similar sorts of activities during the period and what happens to them. Quite a range of situations where sometimes they're simply released after questioning, sometimes executed for carrying correspondence if it seemed to be posing a particular threat to the crown. Also, I'm thinking more widely about the sort of practicalities of actually smuggling correspondence of this sort. So the man's taking the correspondence from the English ambassador's house in Paris to near London, where there's a particularly prominent Huguenot exile, a French Protestant cardinal who is resident in England during this period. So there's that sort of wider context to think how you go about the practicalities of carrying correspondence, which is difficult enough even at a time because of the distances, the practicalities of carrying correspondence, but actually thinking in this period how you do this under the radar in a clandestine fashion, and a particular danger to those individuals who are carrying the correspondence. So I'm interested in the sort of wider sort of political context of this, the social context as well. What happens to these sorts of individuals who are carrying out these activities really because of their religious faith? There's no particularly economic gain or any other kind of gain to carrying out these activities, which are highly dangerous. So from that particular instance, I'm looking at these kinds of activities as far as I can trace them within the archival record. I'm looking at the local, so the context of Dieppe, for instance, thinking about the position of Normandy, which is on the frontier between France and England, particularly much activity during that period, the confessional community in Dieppe, how they're able to sustain themselves, looking at the national context of the relationship between the Huguenots and the French crown, looking at the international context, the support of England and German Protestant princes for the Huguenots in France, for instance, the concerns of the English about French support for the Scottish Queen at that time, Mary Queen of Scots. So there's all kinds of sort of context and wider extrapolation from this one document that I can think about, which makes it a really exciting project for me. And this is the sort of perfect place to do it, both sort of based in Paris, just right in the heart of 16th century Paris, very close to the archives that I use, judicial archives, correspondence of various sorts, and actually sort of tracing some of these activities is really fascinating. And thinking more widely about what that can tell us about how a minority can sustain itself in a very hostile environment.